So, hi everybody, welcome to the Uber Cordero show this wonderful Sunday afternoon. And this week we're going to be talking about Russia and Africa. And we think it's important for our listeners to have a general understanding of Africa's relationship with other powers, not only the European countries, China, and the United States. We also want to broaden this conversation to include some less than talked powers that also engage the African continent. Now, if you're new to this show, please subscribe and follow us on social media at the Uber Cordero Show. I will also want to share with you that this show is run on a radio station called BlackAtlanticRadio.com, hosted by DJ Kerry Pastaina. So if you miss an episode, be sure to check it out on BlackAtlanticRadio.com, where it's running every day. Um, so in order to talk about Russia and Africa, I'm going to share my screen with you so you can follow this lecture. And the topic, like I said, is post-Cold War Russo-African relation. And this is a conversation that explores factors influencing Russia's foreign policy to Africa, with emphasis on how Russia's engagement with the continent has changed in the 21st century. So that's really what we're talking about. And some of the things that we want to talk about is to contextualize the continent of Africa. I think most listeners or people living in outside the continent do not know how vast and large the continent is. And I just wanted to reiterate that the continent of Africa, as shown in this map, which has been going around in social media and on the internet for quite a while, but it is still significant to understand that the size of the continent of Africa can fit China, United States, Eastern Europe, India, Japan, and half of China again, as well as Spain, France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. So the continent is a huge place, and it's incredible how big it is. And that makes it almost impossible to generalize because of so much nuances that go in analyzing a place as big as the continent of Africa. Still, though, there are significant players in the continent. And there's like the big three African countries. And one of them is Nigeria. The other one is South Africa. There's also Egypt, if you include North Africa, and also the secondary powers. Here we are talking about Morocco, Kenya, Ethiopia, and the Congo sometimes. So when you talk about Africa, it's incredibly difficult to generalize. But for the sake of understanding, we still have to generalize. And that means we assess some of the more impactful actors in the continent. And those are some of the countries that I've mentioned tend to be opinion leaders, so to speak, on the continent. And their actions or what happens to them tend to reverberate across the continent. Now, Russia and Africa, and I'm going to talk about this asking about 4 questions. And one of them is, what are the interests of Russia in Africa? What is the nature of the relationship with Africa? How does this relationship change the future of Russia and Africa? Who benefits from this relationship? And these questions are going to guide our conversation as we move forward. And that is where we start with why Russia is interested in Africa. And one important factor to remember is that the primary goal of Russia's interaction with Africa is embedded on the idea that Russia would like to regain its geopolitical significance. And that is a primary driving factor for Russia after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the breakaway of the Soviet Union. So Russia sees Africa as an opportunity to come back in the global scene as a dominant power that deserves respect. And Africa offers that through two things. One, it offers opportunities for enhanced diplomatic engagements. It also offers access to natural resources like oil and gas. There's also an increasing military relationship that has been going on between Russia and African countries. And so far, about 20 African countries have signed military agreements with Russia. And this has been happening since the end of the Cold War. And there's kind of an ethical dynamic to this discussion of military relationship, and for who and for what are these military deals made, considering that for the most part the continent of Africa has been stable in terms of interstate wars. Like there's not been a lot of Ghana attacking Nigeria. There's more been internal conflicts within the state, like what is normally called civil war. So one has to question what these military relationships mean for these countries. There's also this dynamic, as seen in the movie The Lord of War, what we call the war millionaires, people who profit from conflict. So another way you want to look at this is, what is Russia selling in Africa, and why is it selling Africa? And if it is arms and ammunitions and military arsenal, then you want to think about who is profiting in such discussion. And it's an incredible discussion we can have. And I'm not gonna offer values or take a position, but I'm just gonna make the listeners or people who follow me think about that in a more detailed manner. There's also the idea that if you're friends with the euro, then does it mean that you are enemies um, with Russia? And African countries have to play that dangling game. It's like a war, it's a dance where they have to choose and pick who their partners in the global scene are. And Russia makes it even more challenging because it's there and is willing to engage African states. So they are also kind of engaged in this dance of whether to be with the European partners, the Americans, the Chinese, and now the Russians, also the Indians. But it's one that is influenced by the idea of real politics, that states are going to pursue their interests, and the weak states in that system are likely to be eaten up by the more powerful or prosperous countries. And Russia is offering an alternative worldview to what the Americans and the Europeans are offering Africa. One premise on democracy and human rights and economic interdependence. And Russia is giving an alternate voice that says, well, look out for yourself. The world is rough and small countries have no place. And if you are not careful, somebody is going to eat your lunch. And these states, especially these African states, have to embolden themselves, be friends, powerful actors that can defend them. And that's really what is driving this relationship. The idea that African states, some African states, especially what is normally called the rogue states, find solace in the absence of Moscow. Another illustration of how this relationship is complicated is the idea of the G8. And here, Russia sees that the organization is itself irrelevant. And if it is relevant only to the greatest powers. And in fact, the Obama administration in 2014 disinvited Russia from the G8 meetings. I'm not sure if Trump invited Russia back to the G8, but it was talking about it. I'm not sure, I'm not up to date with that information. So Russia is seeking to find alternative ways that it can leverage its influence, especially because it is such a big country and with such a more global presence. And it sees the G8 as old school and irrelevant, and now it's going directly to this African state to see if it can find something for itself. And lastly, Russia's Russia is big on gas and oil and is probably one of the world's largest producers of oil and gas. But these resources are not infinite. They can be depleted. And Russia sees Africa as an opportunity to be relevant because Africa never stops finding oil and gas and other precious minerals. Like the continent is exceedingly rich, and every year new countries find voluminous oil and gas resources that are mineable. And so Russia wants to find itself relevant in terms of natural resources through these African states. Now, let's examine the history of Africa's relationship with Russia, especially from the Soviet era briefly and to the 21st century. And one of the things that we want to talk about is the fact that before 1990, Russia was a major presence in African politics. Many African countries were leaning toward communist models inspired by Russia through what was then called the solidarity of the poor, against the imperialists. Now, countries like the Congo Brazzaville, Congo Kinshasa, and Patrice Lumumba, Tanzania, Ethiopia at some point, under Mengistu, Somalia under Said Barre, Benin, and an assortment of other countries followed this socialist path and were fellows with the Soviet Union, which offered incredible support for these regimes developmentally and militarily. Russia also supported South Sudan in its pursuit of independence during the Cold War by arming fighting South Sudanese fighters against Khartoum, Sudan. So Russia was present, and the reason it was is because it was seeking to expand, and it saw some of the states at what was then called satellite states to expand communism as an alternative view of the world against the capitalist West, led by the United States, Britain, and West Germany, and sometimes France, sometimes not. Now, this was Russia's height of global relevance, and it ended first in 1990, starting from 80s when the Russian Soviet state became so dysfunctional, and by the late 80s, many countries broke away. The Soviets started becoming independent, and by the time the Berlin Wall is collapsing in 89, Russia is already incredibly in a lot of pressure to release many of these countries so they can become independent states, and many do in 1990. So the Soviet Union is broken down, and Russia is now itself a slightly less important player in the world, and is embarrassed for losing the Cold War. And it withdraws from Africa. It withdraws because it does not have resources to compete with the United States again, but also because the United States is making it known to the world that it is the only power of some clout in the world, and every state in the world has to face Washington. And this is the time of the Washington Consensus. This is the time when neoliberalism is taking hold and everybody is embracing democracy and democratization. Now, in 1999, at the onset of Putin's regime, Russia enters the G8, and Russia wants to back again. They want to be not dominant. They want to be a dominant power. And Putin has these ambitions of a global Russia. So he begins a process of re-engaging with other powers overseas, not only the countries in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. So Russia begins to make up with Africa and to reestablish these relationships that were kind of not existing at this point. Now, by 2008, especially starting from 2000, Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe, or Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe, is already in problem with Western powers, and Russia comes in a great help. Russia and China combine to veto the United Nations resolution to put sanctions on Zimbabwe for land reforms that targeted white Zimbabweans and who owned quite a big chunk. It's another story. I'm not going to get into it. But Russia supports Zimbabwe and China. And Russia is kind of like showing to the world that we are going to be picking these countries that are called rogue states internationally, and we're going to befriend them and make them relevant and make them not become collapsed states. So at this time, Russia has over 60 million barrels of oil. Russian companies such as Alrosa, Renova, Nolseric estimate to invest over, the next 5 years or so, about 5 billion in sub-Saharan African natural resource and industry. So Russia signs a lot of economic assistance and technical agreement with about 42 African countries, about 20 military partnerships, and a lot more is on the offing in regards to Russia's relationship with Africa, starting from around 2000. So in terms of trade, Russia is not as competitive to USA, China, India, or even the European Union. In fact, trade volumes increased from $350 million in 2000 to about $1.6 million in 2009. And export has grown from 1947 to about 4 billion by 2009. In the same year, Russia maintained a trade surplus of about 3 billion with Africa. And the reason why Russia maintains a surplus trade volume up to now, this is 2009 statistics, but they haven't changed much in the recent past, is because Russia, as much as it's not as industrialized as Western countries, it has a substantial industrial power and it sells manufactured goods, while Africa only sells commodity goods. Now, you can see the increase in trade volume from this graph, which tracks it from 1997 to 2007, that decade. And you see that African exports increasing starting from about 2000, right? That's 2 years into Putin's term, and it surges across exponentially. And imports have been steady for quite a while, and still so. So the nature of this relationship is determined by trade, state visits, and military relationship. And I'm gonna go a little farther on those discussions later on when I'm talking about it much more in elaborate details. But that doesn't mean that Russia's relationship with Africa do not have constraints. One of the biggest constraints is that they produce similar goods. Both of them export natural gas and oil in the international market. Russia does that, Africa does that. So the only leverage is that Russia has a lot of comparative advantage in production of arms and military ammunition. So Russia sells those kind of things, which is itself an ethical question. I'm going to get into it in a little while. Russia has pursued strong relationship with pariah states like Sudan, Zimbabwe, as well as some, a country like Algeria and Equatorial Guinea. There's also the problem of racism in Russia. The Russian states do not have an history of multi-ethnic identity outside Central Asia and Eastern Europe. So people who are Black go in there and they face problems of integration. And Russia has to confront this problem because if we want to engage with Africa, that's such a big problem um, in Africa. Racial treatment is important to African leaders and African people. So that is itself a constraint of a relationship. And the most important constraint, perhaps, is the fact that USA, EU, and China is so huge, and Africa's trade with Russia is minimal. So there's not a lot of room to grow. And the World Cup in 2018 gave Russia an opportunity to show the world that it has arrived and that it is an important player. And of incredible significance in this tournament was how effectively organized it was. It was so done well. Many pundits said it was the best organized World Cup for a long time. And African teams participated in it, took lessons, and Russia used that opportunity to market itself as an alternative way of development for African states. So many were saying, well, you can do this without democracy. You can organize world-class events, you can build world-class infrastructure, and you can still be as welcoming as and respectful to people's cultures. And that was the World Cup in 2018 was Russia's global marketing campaign, and it effectively did that. And many authoritarian leaders in Africa kind of liked it. So what does this relationship mean? Part of it is that it's increasing Russia's global significance, even as it does the same for Africa. It's not like Africa hasn't been significant globally. It's just that that significance has not been clearly appreciated. And the coming of China and Russia into the scene makes Africa even a much more critical player in international discussion. What it also does is moderates Russia's form of extremism so that at home, it's an authoritarian regime, but Russia, and it's an expansionist regime for neighboring countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and some other countries in Eastern Europe. But when it comes to Africa, Russia is more diplomatic and welcoming, and it has hosted, in 2018 alone, it hosted African leaders about 6 times. There also been several state visits to South Africa and other countries. So Africa is becoming more, Russia is becoming more diplomatic to African players because it sees that it is important. And it has seen China winning in Africa, and it thinks it also has a chance to win. And that's important. It's important for Russia to ensure that it has a piece of this cake. And it's also a question, is Africa getting recolonized? So that is, for me, for anybody watching this show, you want to ask, what is Russia's interest in Africa? Particularly, is it interested in oil? Or is it interested in the development of a better Africa? I mean, that's got to be Africans doing that for themselves. But the mere fact that Russia is coming in here and is engaging a lot of it, a lot of its relationship is with oil-producing countries. For example, there is this mercenary group called the Wagner Group, Wagner, W-A-G-N-E-R, which is incredibly has been cited for hosting mercenaries that fought in Libya and also was seen in Sudan, helping authoritarian regimes cling to power. So it's like a mercenary group. They hired private military operatives. And John Bolton, who used to be an advisor to the President Trump, said that the new US strategy for Africa must confront the fact that China and Russia are way ahead and forging alliances that could be consequential in the coming decades. So now, if the US is not in play, it might lose the future because the world is definitely going to be populated by these developing countries that are increasingly developing and industrializing and becoming much more relevant. So Russia is aggressively seeking deals with African countries because it sees that the future is going to be determined by newly industrializing countries, many of them in what used to be colonized societies. And today, Africa accounts for about 16% of Russia's major exports, according to Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And Algeria accounts for about 80% of weapon deals, even though Russia also has weapon deals with Angola, with Nigeria, with Sudan, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Equatorial Guinea. So Russia's is expanding who it trades with, but tends to be trading more with oil producing and gas producing countries. And a little bit about the mercenary groups in Central African Republic that had a small civil war starting from 2013. Russia sent mercenaries to help keep the regime afloat. And these mercenaries were fighting rebels that were almost taking over the capital, the Bangui, the capital. But these mercenaries helped this regime stay in power. It's a private army. So now, if you're hiring private armies to protect a sovereign state, it's a little murky. The ethics are not really clear, and we have to be very aware of what this means. I'm not making a judgment. I'm just saying that some of these things needs a little more careful thinking. So in short, what I'm talking about is that Russia's relationship with African countries tend to be determined mostly by oil and natural resources and military deals. And it poses the question of whether this relationship leads to conflicts or they end conflict. It also poses the question of Russia's intention. Is it for Africa or is it for Russia itself? Now, that is the end of my presentation on Russia. And I'm hoping that you've enjoyed it. And if you like it, I urge you to subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends and continue engaging with me by sending me questions, commenting, and telling me other topics that you think I should cover. Thank you and have a beautiful Sunday.